German logistics is our strongest weapon. Those were the confident words of the Wehrmacht's planners in the early years of World War II. Germany's armies had stormed across Europe using blitzkrieg, fast-moving armored forces supported by tight logistical planning. They believed no other nation could match their efficiency. They believed no other country could build, supply, and move a modern army as quickly and reliably as they could. But in the summer of 1944, on the battlefields of France, those beliefs were about to collapse. And the reason was trucks. Not tanks, not aircraft, not battleships. Trucks and the people who drove them. For decades after the war, Germany's top surviving generals wrote glowing memoirs describing their strategic genius and the fighting power of their troops. But buried inside those same writings was a quiet admission of something that terrified them far more than any battlefield defeat. They heard a new sound across France, a deep, endless rumble, the sound of engines, gears, and tires, a sound that didn't stop at night, a sound that meant defeat. Those German officers, trained in the virtues of precision and discipline, listened from their captured headquarters and saw long lines of olive-drab trucks rolling non-stop toward the front. The Allies had built something that defied their doctrines and ignored every logistical limit Germany believed existed. They called it the Red Ball Express, and it changed the course of the war. To understand why, we must go back to June 1944. D-Day, the moment the Allies finally returned to Europe. Tens of thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches. They fought, bled, and died securing a foothold that would allow the liberation of France. But once the beaches were theirs, then came the real challenge: supplying the invasion. Because conquering territory is simple compared to sustaining an army once it begins to move. Fuel, food, ammunition, medical supplies, every single bullet, every single drop of gasoline had to cross the English Channel, arrive on the beaches, move through makeshift depots, and then somehow reach soldiers who were advancing far faster than planners expected. Patton's tanks, Bradley's infantry, and British forces on the left, all were surging forward. But the ports of France were still in German hands. Railroads were wrecked by bombing and sabotage. Bridges lay in twisted steel piles. The Allies had planned to move at a steady pace across Normandy. Instead, the German front suddenly cracked open in July, and Patton burst through like lightning unleashed. The good news: the German army was collapsing. The bad news: the American army risked outrunning its supplies. Every tanker and truck that reached Normandy was immediately pushed into service. But it wasn't enough. Fuel was becoming a currency more valuable than gold. Tank crews siphoned gasoline from wrecked vehicles, rationed food, and sometimes sat immobile waiting for resupply. The American advance, the momentum won by thousands of lives, was in danger of stalling. And then a radical idea emerged. What if the Allies did something completely unprecedented? What if they created a supply system so massive and so fast that it would seem like magic to the enemy? A general named John C.H. Lee and members of the Transportation Corps proposed it. A nonstop convoy, thousands of trucks, moving 24 hours a day on a road network used only for supplies and nothing else. A supply highway, not a road that trucks used, but a road built for trucks. Dedicated lanes. No traffic in the opposite direction.
No civilian vehicles. No stopping. No slowing.
Just cargo moving constantly like blood racing through arteries. It would be dangerous. It would push men and machines to their breaking point. And it required one critical resource: drivers. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated by race. African American soldiers were often denied combat roles and relegated to support units, despite being eager to fight. But in logistics, they found their battlefield. Nearly 75% of the drivers recruited to this new operation were Black American soldiers. Young men from Detroit, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Los Angeles, told by their own country that they were not qualified to shoot but essential enough to drive. And drive they did. They took the wheel of the Army's iconic GMC CCKW-2 and a half-ton cargo truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half. Reliable, rugged, underpowered, but built in numbers Hitler could never dream of. The operation needed a name, something bold, Military planners borrowed a symbol from American railroads. A red circle painted on signs meant high-priority cargo, cargo that never stopped. A red ball. They created a patch and painted it on everything. Red Ball Express. Officially launched on August 25, 1944, its mission was simple: deliver supplies faster than Patton could use them. In truth, it was the most complex logistical gamble the U.S. Army would undertake in the entire war. The men received a crash course in navigation, mechanics, and convoy discipline. They were told, stay in line. Don't turn headlights on at night. Only hooded blackout lamps allowed. If a truck breaks down, drag it off the road. No one stops moving. Ever. They wore leather gloves, goggles, and dust masks. The roads were dirt. Rain turned them into mud. Winter turned them to ice. The trucks shook so violently that bones ached after a single shift. And those shifts? 16 hours driving. 8 hours resting. If rest could be found with artillery in the distance and engines roaring by. The route stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the advancing front. Sometimes over 400 miles one way as the lines advanced. Convoys formed in long columns, often 50 trucks or more, each spaced just far enough apart to avoid collisions in the dark. The lead vehicle had a white star illuminated by a tiny shielded lamp. The tail vehicle carried a blue light that glowed like a ghost in the night. When the convoys passed French towns, civilians gathered to cheer. Children waved. Farmers saluted. They understood what these trucks meant. Liberation required gunfire, but victory required fuel. German prisoners watched silently from barbed wire enclosures. They saw the endless stream of trucks. They listened to the engines growl without pause. They whispered to each other, "How can America have so much?" They had believed the Allies would run out of everything before reaching Germany. The German war machine, which once prided itself on logistical brilliance, now found itself starving on the battlefield. German tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they were empty. Fuel shortages strangled German resistance. Meanwhile, American trucks rolled on. The Red Ball Express was dangerous duty. German fighter bombers prowled the roads by day. Snipers took shots from hedgerows. Landmines and booby traps lined the routes. Tired drivers drifted off at the wheel, crashing into ditches or other trucks. Yet morale remained fierce, because they knew something few others did. They were winning the war. Men with never-fired rifles, but with nerves of steel, were fueling Patton's dash into Germany. Imagine a dark French roadway at 3 a.m. Cold wind slicing through an open cab. Headlights off. Only shadows moving. Your truck's engine rattling beneath your feet. You can't slow down. You can't turn around. You know the Germans are somewhere ahead. Too close. And behind you? Only more trucks. Supplies as far as the eye can't see. You keep moving, because if you stop, soldiers will die. The Transportation Corps estimated that 30% of trucks broke down daily. Roadside mechanics, often the same drivers who had been behind the wheel minutes earlier, worked by feel in darkness, hands deep in grease, replacing fan belts, patching tires, and praying the convoy didn't leave them behind. Convoys never traveled empty on the return trip. They carried wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, captured equipment. Every journey mattered. Every mile counted. Some drivers, after delivering their supplies, volunteered to grab a rifle and join nearby infantry in a firefight, only to climb back into a truck when the shooting stopped, hands trembling, heartbeats still racing. But the greatest danger wasn't bullets. It was fatigue, endless, merciless exhaustion. These men lived on coffee, adrenaline, and cigarettes. The road blurred into a dark river. The hum of the engine hypnotized. Many crashed not from enemy fire, but from sleep that their bodies could no longer refuse. Yet every morning the convoys rolled again. Across the battle lines, German high command analyzed reports that made no sense. American divisions that should have been immobilized were gaining speed. Tanks that should have been fuel-starved were sprinting. General Feld Marshal von Rundstedt demanded answers. How were the Americans sustaining such a pace without ports? How could so many supplies be delivered so deep into France? A German officer studying captured maps finally gave the terrible truth. They have turned the roads themselves into a weapon. The Red Ball Express grew to nearly 6,000 trucks. More than 23,000 soldiers, primarily African American, kept the roads alive. They averaged 12,500 tons of supplies delivered every single day. Food, fuel, ammunition, tires, spare parts. Over 82 days of continuous operation, August 25th to November 16th, 1944, they delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. Well over 100 million ton-miles achieved. No army in history had ever moved that much material that fast. As Patton himself put it, "My men can eat their belts if they have to, but my tanks have got to have gas." Without the Red Ball Express, his tanks would have stopped in Normandy. Instead, they thundered forward. German generals could not believe what they were witnessing. Blitzkrieg, their signature style of warfare, had been turned against them. They were the ones scrambling. They were the ones running out of fuel. They were the ones fighting with desperation. They realized the truth they had ignored for too long. The United States of America was not just a nation. It was an industrial civilization, fully mobilized for war. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, Los Angeles. Entire cities worked night and day to build vehicles, engines, rubber tires, weapons, crates, and fuel cans. Gasoline flowed like water. Steel rolled off production lines faster than ships could carry it. Men who once drove taxis, buses, and delivery trucks now drove the lifelines of liberation. In the U.S., industries that once made toys and toasters now made tank parts and truck engines. The entire country became a factory, and the Red Ball Express was the final link in a chain of production that stretched from home to the front line. German generals, writing after the war, grudgingly admitted it. "We lost the war because we were outsupplied." But those supplies didn't magically appear. They were delivered by men in helmets and gloves, gripping steering wheels and shifting gears through fear and fatigue. And the Germans heard it every night. The rumble of engines. The promise of an army that would never stop. The Red Ball Express was more than logistics, it was psychological warfare. The constant sound of American vehicles told the Germans a story louder than any propaganda leaflet. The Allies had unlimited supplies. They had unlimited momentum. They were coming, and they could not be stopped. Somewhere in a truck cab, a young American soldier, perhaps no older than 19, tapped the clutch, shifted to third gear, and pushed forward through the night. He wasn't a hero in a traditional sense. He wasn't firing a gun or storming a bunker. But his courage fed the fight. His determination fueled the advance. His wheels wrote the future. Patton's divisions continued their aggressive push, outrunning intelligence predictions. Town after town, river after river, the German front shrank like a curtain being pulled back. Every mile gained owed its existence to miles driven on the Red Ball routes. The drivers may not have seen the liberation of Paris firsthand, but they helped make it possible. They may not have seen soldiers raising the American flag over captured fortifications, but they delivered the ammunition that enabled it. They may not have received medals for valor in battle, but they risked death every day to ensure others could fight another tomorrow. This was a war fought with trucks, with grease and grit, with drivers who refused to stop. As the Allies prepared for their final drive toward Germany, the Red Ball Express stood as the iron backbone of the Western Front. The undeniable proof that the United States had mastered the art of war not only with firepower, but with logistics. And the Germans finally understood the scope of the disaster facing them. They were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting a supply chain. And that supply chain had a name: Red Ball Express. The war was not yet won. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The trucks kept rolling. Patton once wrote that battles might be won by weapons, but wars were won by logistics. In France, during the late summer of 1944, that theory was being proven every single night. Daylight belonged to tanks, infantry, artillery. Night belonged to the Red Ball Express. The trucks rolled out of Normandy like a flood controlled only by the discipline of drivers who learned to follow the faint glow of the truck ahead. The men joked that they didn't need maps. They just had to stay in line and pray the lead driver didn't make a wrong turn. but everyone understood the stakes. A wrong turn could lead a convoy into German-held territory. A stop could mean a sniper's bullet from the shadows. The drivers were warned. If you have engine trouble, get that truck off the road. Do not stop the convoy. The fight depends on constant motion. On the supply roads, motion was survival. Each truck carried enough fuel to keep an armored division attacking for minutes, not hours. Enough rations to feed an infantry battalion for a day. Enough ammunition to turn the tide of a firefight. Every truck mattered. Each cargo manifest meant that somewhere ahead, men were waiting needing that load. Soldiers with empty fuel tanks. Gunners running low on rounds. Artillery crews counting shells left in the crate. Hungry troops who hadn't had a hot meal in 2 days. The drivers did not deliver supplies. They delivered hope. And they delivered it under grueling conditions. The primary route began near the beaches of Normandy, then climbed eastward through battered French countryside. Houses with missing roofs. Bridges hastily rebuilt. Craters swallowing entire lanes. Traffic moved like an artery clogged with debris and war. The French called out to the passing convoys. Merci.
Merci.
Waving flags and tossing flowers. For many drivers, it was the first time they felt truly welcomed as equals in a foreign land. In America, they had boarded military buses through separate doors. In France, children ran alongside their trucks cheering them like heroes. But danger lurked everywhere. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, still had enough teeth to dive on lonely stretches of road. The trucks were armed only with machine guns mounted behind the cab, mostly manned by volunteers who had never been trained for combat. When German aircraft strafed the convoys, those gunners fired back fiercely, the trucks weaving under blackout conditions as tracer rounds arced into the night sky. Mechanical breakdowns were constant. The deuce-and-a-half trucks were sturdy, but the roads punished them relentlessly. Engines overheated, tires shredded, brakes seized from overuse. Drivers carried toolkits and spare parts, and learned to become mechanics on the move. One soldier later recalled, "We could change a tire faster than a NASCAR pit crew." To keep the roads safe, military police monitored every mile, ensuring no civilians or unauthorized vehicles interfered. MPs also handled a more serious threat: sabotage. German stragglers and local collaborators sometimes placed mines or shot at convoys. Drivers responded with speed, instinct, and nerves of steel. There was no armor between them and the enemy, only sheet metal and courage. Commanders calculated daily requirements: 350,000 gallons of fuel for Third Army alone. Ammunition measured by the shipload. Rations for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But the faster the Allies advanced, the longer the convoys had to travel. Every mile gained was a mile that had to be supplied. The trucks stretched further and further from the coast, burning the same fuel they were sent to deliver. Logistics officers warned that the supply lines were at breaking point. Yet stopping wasn't an option. Slowing wasn't an option. Patton didn't understand the word pause. One general joked, "We're riding on a logistics razor blade." Every morning began the same. Men stumbled from their cots, or the ground where they collapsed the night before, into the driver's seat once again. The trucks roared to life in clouds of diesel smoke. Engines groaned as gears were forced into motion. 16 hours of driving. 8 hours of rest if they were lucky. And then they did it again. Nearly 3/4 of Red Ball Express drivers were African American. They came from cities and small towns across the United States. Men who had been treated as second-class citizens at home. The military denied them combat roles. They were told transportation was their proper place. They took that insult and turned it into a weapon of victory. Black drivers formed the backbone of the operation, despite facing discrimination from the very army they served. They ate in separate mess halls. They slept in separate tents. Some highways had separate rest stops. Military police sometimes harassed them instead of helping them. Yet on the road, in the dark, under fire, they were all that stood between success and collapse. These men found dignity behind the wheel. They found respect from soldiers who relied on them. They proved every racist assumption wrong. mile by mile. As one driver said, "We had to fight to get into a fight. Then we had to fight to be recognized for the fight we fought." French civilians and liberated prisoners treated them warmly. Many black drivers later said they had never experienced such freedom or such gratitude in their lives. They were not just drivers. They were liberators. Every convoy had a leader, usually a lieutenant, who maintained discipline and cohesion. He rode at the front, navigating a route that changed constantly due to bomb damage and shifting battle lines. Convoys communicated through hand signals, horn blasts, and instinct. Radios were scarce. Navigation relied on painted red ball signs nailed to trees or propped against ruins. Crude markers guiding thousands of trucks like breadcrumbs across devastated landscapes. In daylight hours, dust churned into thick brown clouds. Drivers coughed dirt for hours afterward. Goggles clung to sweaty faces. Sunburn etched into the skin around those goggle lines, creating a permanent reminder of the road. At night, blackout rules eliminated headlights. Drivers leaned forward with white-knuckled intensity, straining to see the faint outline of the truck ahead. A moment of distraction, a single mistake, could trigger a deadly pileup. Despite all this, they laughed when they could. They traded stories of home. They talked about music, sports, and dreams of what they'd do when the war was over. Hope kept them sharp when fear made eyelids heavy. As Allied forces pushed deep into France, German high command searched desperately for signs of fuel shortage or supply delays. They assumed the Americans could not sustain such momentum. They waited for Patton's tanks to stop, but the trucks never stopped. German officers interrogating American prisoners asked endlessly, "How many trucks do you have? How many gallons of fuel are coming through? How long can you maintain this?" The prisoners couldn't answer because no one knew, not even the Americans. The scale of supply was so large that men did not think in numbers. They only saw trucks, hundreds, thousands, moving like migrating herds. A captured German colonel admitted, "We could not understand how an army could move with such speed when we had destroyed the railroads and ports. Then we saw the convoys, and we understood. They had underestimated American industry, the factories, the workers, the assembly lines, the sheer abundance. To Germany, the sight was terrifying. To America, it was Tuesday. Every broken truck was a catastrophe waiting to multiply. If one broke down in the lane, dozens could be delayed. So mechanics became heroes hidden in grease and grime. Roadside repair crews worked at all hours, replacing radiators torn by shrapnel, rebuilding transmissions ruined by overdrive heat, hammering bent fenders back into place. They worked in rain, in freezing winds, in darkness so complete that they navigated engines by touch alone. They kept trucks moving that had no right to move. They kept drivers alive who had no right to survive. They kept Patton's war alive when fuel shortages threatened disaster. One officer said, "The mechanics didn't wear medals, but they held victory in their wrenches." On some nights, more trucks rolled back into the depots broken than intact, only to reappear fully repaired and roaring down the road at dawn. The miracle wasn't just movement. It was recovery. Combat soldiers, skeptical at first, soon realized the truth. No supplies, no advance, no victory. Infantry saluted as convoys passed. Tank crews cheered like fans at a parade. Artillery officers shook hands with drivers delivering crates of shells. A new nickname spread, the lifeline, because that's exactly what they were. The segregation that defined their everyday existence cracked under the weight of necessity. Soldiers began to look at these drivers not by their skin, but by their essential role. Respect replaced indifference. Gratitude replaced prejudice. Even if official army policies took much longer to change. Autumn approached. The front line crawled closer to Germany. Patton's tanks smelled victory. But the strain on the supply system reached critical levels. The routes were stretched so far that trucks consumed massive quantities of the fuel they hauled, making the convoy increasingly inefficient. Every mile gained by the tanks required 2 or 3 miles driven by trucks. A crisis loomed. And Germany, though wounded, was not yet defeated. They were gathering strength, digging in, planning a counterblow that would shock the world. The Red Ball Express had proven its genius, but its greatest test was still ahead. The trucks continued rolling into the night, carrying the lifeblood of the Allied advance toward a storm that would soon erupt. Night and day, forward, always forward, because victory, like fuel, had to be delivered. The last echoes of the artillery faded into the mist as the soldiers of the 141st Infantry Regiment waited, exhausted and cold, surrounded by the towering ridgelines of the Vosges Mountains. Wet leaves clung to their uniforms. The forest floor was a mess of mud, shattered branches, and shell craters filled with rainwater. They had pushed farther into enemy territory than anyone had expected. Too far. And now they were cut off. No one would ever forget the moment reality hit. There was no going back the way they came. German forces had sealed the trail behind them like a steel gate slamming shut. The men tried to stay confident. Some lit cigarettes with shaking hands. Others stared silently at the trees, knowing danger lurked behind every trunk, every rock, every shadow. They didn't yet call themselves lost, but they were starting to feel it. Captain Lyman was pacing, trying to hide his anxiety as he spoke into a radio that hissed with static. The connection was terrible, barely functional. He shouted coordinates, demands, and pleas, hoping someone on the other end could hear. Bridgeport. This is K Company. Position Charlie 5. Request support immediately. We are surrounded. Repeat. Surrounded. The only response was a hollow crackle. The men listened anyway, hoping for a miracle. Corporal Harris struggled to bandage a friend's arm, muttering, "They'll come for us. They have to." But the truth was harsher than their hopes. There was no clear route to reach them. Every path was covered by German machine guns and mortars aimed like jaws waiting to bite shut. And the weather, the cursed weather, might have been the worst enemy of all. A cold autumn wind swept through the forest, followed by sheets of freezing rain that soaked into their bones. Cloaks and jackets clung to their skin like ice. The fog was so thick that visibility dwindled to a few dozen feet. Good for hiding, yes, but terrifying when you could hear German footsteps nearby and never see the faces behind them. Night fell, stretching time into what felt like forever. The men took turns sleeping in mud, if sleeping could even be the word. Artillery boomed in the distance, sometimes closer, sometimes far, like a giant breathing in the darkness. Every thundering blast reminded them they were trapped between front lines, stranded in the jaws of a relentless enemy. Back at headquarters, the news slithered through the division command like a nightmare made real. A battalion has vanished. The 141st is cut off. General Dahlquist slammed his fist on the table so hard the coffee cups jumped. "Then we uncut them," he roared. "I'm not losing those boys." Everyone nodded, though in their hearts, some doubted whether any force could break through. The 36th Division had been battered for weeks. They were running low on everything: ammunition, food, even dry socks. The Vosges Mountains chewed up entire units and spat out handfuls of survivors. To push deeper felt like walking willingly into a graveyard. But Dahlquist wasn't a man who accepted failure, even when failure seemed logical. He turned to his officers. "We need reserves. Anyone who can still hold a rifle." A quiet pause followed, heavy with the weight of an impossible decision. Then someone said the only words that could change everything. "The 442nd is still combat ready." Those men, the Nisei soldiers, sons of Japanese immigrants, who had been fighting like hell to prove they were American enough. They had just returned from a brutal assault on Bruyères, bodies still aching, boots still muddy with the blood of their own. They should have been resting. Instead, Dahlquist pointed at their unit marker on the map. "Send them forward. They're going to bring our boys home." Orders rippled through channels like lightning. Radios crackled. Messengers ran. Jeeps sped through the mud. Miles away, the soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team were gathered around small fires, finally relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. Many were writing letters, love letters, apologies, promises that one day they would come back home. Lieutenant Kimura stared at a crumpled photo of his younger sister, the one still stuck behind barbed wire in an internment camp. He promised himself he'd make her proud. promised that every bullet he fired brought him one step closer to justice. Sergeant Tanaka leaned against a stump, eyes half closed in fatigue, just beginning to drift into badly needed sleep when a runner appeared. New orders, immediate deployment, full gear. We move in 40 minutes. Groans rippled through the unit. Disbelief, frustration, fear, exhaustion, all rolled into one. What now? Someone asked bitterly. The answer cut deeper than any blade. We're going to rescue Americans who are cut off. They need us. No one cheered, but no one hesitated either, because they believed in one thing stronger than exhaustion. Brothers don't leave brothers behind. As they marched toward the next nightmare, the fog thickened like a living barrier resisting their advance. Tree roots grabbed their boots. The mud pulled them down. Rain drummed on helmets like a ceaseless reminder that the world itself wanted them to turn back. Machine gun fire erupted ahead. Mortars crashed around them. The forest lit up in flashes of fire and death. The 442nd pushed forward anyway. Bodies hit the ground. Some screaming, some silent. There was no time to mourn. Not yet. Every second mattered. Every gasp of breath was borrowed against an unknown debt. They fought uphill, each step a war of its own. The Germans fought like guardians of a fortress, because that's exactly what the forest had become. Every ridge was a fortress wall, every foxhole a bunker, every shadow a threat. But the Nisei soldiers were not ordinary men. They had something to prove to their country, to the world, to history itself. Go for broke, they yelled. The motto that meant risking everything for victory. They crawled through ravines, slipped under wire, hurled grenades into nests of gunfire. Every hill they captured cost blood. The numbers dwindled fast, far too fast, but still they advanced. Back in the trapped battalion's position, morning arrived like a gray, hopeless blanket. Private Cole brushed frost from his rifle, teeth chattering. He hadn't eaten in 2 days except for a few crumbs. He tried to keep spirits up by joking. At least the Germans are keeping us from gaining weight. But laughter came slow, forced, and short-lived. The patrols that ventured out found nothing but danger. Snipers targeted anyone who moved too quickly. Ammunition was disappearing faster than hope. Lieutenant Adams gathered his men. We're holding this ground, no matter what they throw at us. Some nodded, some just stared, and some swallowed the fear that had taken root inside their minds. A fear that whispered, "What if no one is coming?" Then, late in the afternoon, faint echoes drifted through the forest. Not thunder, not artillery. Something else. Gunfire, heavy, relentless gunfire, coming from the direction of the American lines. Corporal Harris perked up. "You hear that?" Cole nodded, eyes widening with the first spark of hope in days. "That's our guys. They're fighting their way here." Everyone looked toward the sound, hearts pounding. For the first time since the trap snapped shut, survival seemed possible. But hope, like fire, must be fed or it dies. Food had run out. Ammunition was almost gone. Men were collapsing not from bullets, but from cold and hunger. Captain Lyman finally managed to reach headquarters through the static. We can't hold much longer. We need supplies. Anything." And someone, God bless whoever it was, replied, "We're sending help from the sky." Hours later, the skies above the forest buzzed with engines. Planes appeared through the mist, first as shadows, then as angels bearing salvation. Parachutes blossomed like flowers of white silk. Cans of rations, crates of ammunition, bandages, water, everything they needed. But the Germans saw it too. Mortars opened fire on the drop zone. Paratroopers in the sky jerked and twisted as bullets shredded the air around them. Some supplies drifted into enemy hands. Some crashed into treetops and split open. Still, enough reached the ground to keep the battalion alive. Soldiers scrambled through mud and gunfire to gather every can, every bullet, every scrap they could carry. And that night, they huddled together, eating as if they'd never tasted food before. Just beans and crackers, but to them it was a feast. The fire may have been small, but the hope was enormous. They whispered the same question over and over. When will the rescue reach us? Deep in the forest, the men of the 442nd pressed forward into yet another ridge. One so steep they practically climbed it on their hands and knees. Machine guns screamed. Mortars rained steel. Trees shattered into splinters that flew like knives. Lieutenant Kimura saw Tanaka collapse beside him, hit in the chest. "Sergeant, stay with me." Tanaka forced a grin, coughing blood. "Make sure they get home." Kimura grabbed his hand, squeezing tightly. "I promise." Above them, artillery flashes painted the sky a hellish orange. Below them, the cries of the wounded mixed with the roar of battle. Between those two worlds, the Nisei soldiers climbed, because on the other side of that ridge were the lost brothers they came to save. The ridge loomed above them like a wall built by giants, coated in wet moss and jagged rock. Breath came out in misty bursts as the men pulled themselves upward, hands numb, muscles screaming. German bullets tore through the branches overhead, snapping wood like brittle bones. Dirt exploded into their faces with every impact. Kimura ducked behind a stump, heart pounding against his ribs. He wiped the mud from his eyes and signaled his squad forward. There was no turning back. Not now, not ever. He whispered to himself, to Tanaka, to all those already fallen. Nearly there. A shout rang out just ahead. A German soldier, barely visible through the swirling fog, leaped onto the ridge edge, shouting orders to others still hidden. Gunfire erupted. A Nisei rifleman fell backward, tumbling down the slope until he crashed against a boulder, motionless. Kimura clenched his teeth. The loss was like a hot spike in his chest, but he used the pain to push harder. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully, one shot, then another. The German soldier dropped. The ridge was theirs, or so it seemed, because as they reached the crest, the true nightmare revealed itself. A fortified line of enemy positions stretching across the summit, bunkers dug into the earth, machine guns mounted behind layers of sandbags. Kill zone. Someone cursed under their breath. They had fought so hard to reach this place, only to discover the Germans were dug in like an iron fist waiting to crush them. Then the command came across the line. Charge! It wasn't shouted in bravado but in desperation, because hesitation meant death. The Nisei soldiers surged forward. Grenades sailed through the air, leaving trails of smoke and light. Rifles cracked. Mud splattered. Screams pierced the fog. Explosions shook the ground under their boots. Earth kicked upward in violent bursts. Splinters and shrapnel cut skin, ripped jackets, shattered helmets. A machine gun nest raked the line, mowing down 3 men before anyone could respond. Kimura and his squad dove behind a log as bullets chewed through the bark above them. Private Akiyama scrambled forward, clutching a satchel of grenades. He moved like a shadow, zigzagging, sliding into cover as enemy fire followed him. He reached the side of the nest, ripped the grenade pin free with his teeth, and threw. Not 1, not 2, but 3 grenades. The bunker erupted into a fireball. Cheers rose from the smoke. Short-lived, replaced by grim determination. It wasn't over. Not even close. They pressed forward again. Another bunker. Another explosion. Another friend gone. One ridge at a time, the forest turned into a battlefield graveyard. Silent trees watching men rewrite the meaning of sacrifice. Hours blurred into a relentless struggle. Rain mixed with blood until the ground turned a dark, slick red. Commanders shouted themselves hoarse. Runners dashed between units and often never returned. Medics crawled into hellish crossfire to drag the wounded to safety, often becoming casualties themselves. And eventually, the breakthrough came. The German lines cracked, not collapsed but bent, and that was enough. The enemy began pulling back, regrouping deeper into the woods. The 442nd didn't celebrate. They simply moved, ignoring their wounds, focusing only on the task that still lay ahead. Nearby, a soldier knelt in the mud, holding the tags of a fallen friend. He placed them gently into his pocket, then stood again because grief would have to wait. They advanced further into the forest, deeper into the jaws of the enemy. Back in the surrounded battalion's position, the men strained to listen. The distant gunfire was louder now, closer, almost on top of them. "Thank God," Harris whispered. But hope was a fragile thing out here. German voices suddenly shouted nearby. Mortars thudded into the ground again. The lost battalion experienced another brutal wave of attacks. Every man rushed to the defensive perimeter, firing until their weapons overheated. Captain Lyman barked orders, trying to cover every weak point. The fighting was chaotic and furious. Desperate men clinging to survival against an enemy determined to finish the job. Then, as quickly as it began, the assault tapered off. German troops melted back into the forest shadows. The silence that followed was suffocating. Adams leaned on his rifle and panted heavily. "They know we're starving," he murmured. "They're waiting for us to break." But the 141st refused to break. They tightened their defense, praying reinforcements would arrive before the final German attack struck again. Night fell like a curtain. The cold was merciless. Men wrapped their arms around themselves, trying to sleep for even a minute. For many, closing their eyes just meant seeing faces of friends who didn't survive the last day. A few whispered prayers into the darkness. And far behind enemy lines, the 442nd kept marching. They left behind medics to care for dozens of wounded comrades who could not continue. Every goodbye felt like a betrayal, but triage demanded cruel decisions. Lieutenant Kimura's legs trembled beneath him from fatigue. His uniform was soaked through with rain, sweat, and blood that wasn't all his. He gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the only thing stopping his hands from shaking. A runner approached breathlessly. "Recon says the lost battalion is less than a mile ahead, but the Germans are preparing a massive defense around them." Kimura nodded grimly. One final fight stood between salvation and tragedy. Commanders convened under a tarp supported by rifles stuck in the mud. They used flashlights pointed into maps that were smeared and nearly unreadable. Someone said quietly, "We're at the end of our strength." Then another voice, clearer, stronger, "So are they. And those men up there, they're counting on us." The plan was formed, not elegant, not perfect, but the only chance. They would strike at daybreak, using every ounce of strength left in their bodies. Sleep came like a thief, brief, hollow, haunted by nightmares. Before dawn, Kimura sat watching the mist swirl between the trees. He thought of Tanaka, of his sister, of all the boys whose families would never know how brave they were. He whispered into the cold air, "One more ridge. One more." Morning light crept through the branches, pale and weak. The soldiers rose, stiff limbs, bruised souls, yet determined. Artillery roared from behind them, opening the final push. The air filled with smoke and thunder. The 442nd charged once more into the crucible of fire. German troops were ready. Bullets rained down. Mortars exploded. Voices shouted commands in German, their echoes intertwined with American cries. In the chaos, Kimura stumbled into a shallow trench. A grenade landed beside him. Without thinking, he kicked it over the edge. The explosion still knocked him backward, ears ringing. He forced himself up. Pain was a luxury he could not afford. The ridge ahead was crawling with enemy defenders. And then something pierced the noise. A shout. Faint, but unmistakable. "Over here!" Kimura froze. It was coming from the other side of the ridge. Another voice followed. Hoarse, desperate, filled with hope. "Americans! We're Americans! Keep coming!" Kimura's heart surged with adrenaline. "We hear you," he yelled. "We're coming." The final push became a sprint powered by something beyond human limits. Every bullet hole in the ground they leapt over. Every scream they ignored. Every fear they buried deep. The Germans attempted one last stand, firing wildly, howling in rage as their grips slipped. Grenades flew. Bayonets clashed. Commands dissolved into pure survival. Then, bursting through the smoke, Kimura saw them, haggard, skinny, filthy, faces gaunt, uniforms tattered, eyes wide with disbelief. The lost battalion. For a moment, everything stopped. Silence took hold, broken only by ragged breathing. A soldier from the 141st stared at the Nice men approaching and whispered, You came for us? Kimura nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Behind him, more 442nd soldiers appeared, battered, bloodied, limping but victorious. Survivors embraced rescuers. Hands gripped shoulders. Tears mixed with mud. Laughter cracked through lips that hadn't smiled in days. It was raw. It was human. It was beautiful. But beneath every celebration came the weight of the cost. Medics moved among the wounded, counting. Officers took rough tallies of the dead. Dozens of stretchers were laid out side by side. The price of this salvation had been staggering. The 442nd had come into this forest with thousands. Hundreds would never walk out again. As they prepared to lead the survivors back toward friendly lines, Kimura looked around. The relief of rescue was powerful, but the sorrow of sacrifice was overwhelming. One of the rescued soldiers approached him. He had a makeshift bandage around his head and a hollow look in his eyes. I don't know how to thank you, he said softly. Kimura managed a tired, thin smile. Just get home, he replied. That's thanks enough. The soldier nodded, tears forming. They began their long march back, every step agonizing, every mile feeling endless. But they were no longer alone, no longer lost. The forest behind them still echoed with the ghosts of the fallen. But ahead was home. The story of the lost battalion and the heroic men who saved them would be remembered, not just for courage in battle, but for honor in the face of prejudice. Boys who were once doubted, distrusted, and pushed aside had proven themselves among the most loyal and fearless soldiers in American history. Their legacy wasn't in medals, though they earned more than any other unit of their size. It wasn't even in the battles, though they won some of the hardest. Their legacy was simple, powerful, and eternally true. Brothers don't abandon brothers. The forest of the Vosges slowly faded behind them, but the memory of every hill, every sacrifice remained carved into the hearts of the men who fought there. Victory in Europe was far from guaranteed. Winter was coming, and the German war machine was wounded but still full of fury. Yet deep in the minds of Hitler's generals, a chilling realization had already begun to take shape. They weren't just fighting American soldiers. They were fighting American supply, a force far more relentless than tanks or artillery, a power they had underestimated. Because wars can be won by courage on the battlefield, but they are lost when the fuel runs dry. During the early stages of the war, German high command laughed at the Americans for their obsession with vehicles, fuel depots, spare parts, all the logistics they themselves were struggling to maintain across stretched lines. Field Marshal von Rundstedt once scoffed to his staff. These Americans think wars are won with gasoline and trucks. He wasn't laughing anymore. The Allied breakout from Normandy had turned into something terrifying. A steel hurricane racing east, faster than the Germans believed physically possible. And at the center of that speed, snarling like a hungry beast eager to devour Europe, was Patton. General George S. Patton, Jr., a man with a mind like a battlefield and a heart that beat only for victory. His tanks didn't crawl, they thundered. They punched through German lines with the force of a storm. Every mile conquered, every bridge captured, every town liberated fueled his growing legend. But there was a problem with Patton's genius. His army was moving so fast that the fuel trucks couldn't keep up. In early September 1944, American tanks rolled to a halt, not because the Germans stopped them, but because their gas tanks were empty. Patton fumed, pacing like a lion in a cage. My men can eat their belts if they have to, he growled. But my tanks have got to have gas. The Allies had the supplies, mountains of them, back in Normandy. The issue was getting those mountains across France before the fighting spirit ahead turned into a stranded question mark. The ports weren't ready. The railways were wrecked. Pipelines were incomplete. They needed a new solution, something bold, something fast, something never tried before. And so, a revolutionary idea was born. Create a highway that never sleeps. A road system where trucks move in one direction only, full throttle, no stops. supplies loaded on one end, a fuel-hungry army waiting on the other. They called it the Red Ball Express. That name came from the railway slang for priority express cargo, and it fit perfectly, because nothing in this war would have a higher priority. The logistics staff ripped into France like architects of speed, signage, checkpoints, fuel depots, maintenance yards, everything built at breathtaking pace. The routes were painted with bright red circles, guiding the truck convoys day and night through bomb-scarred landscapes. 5,958 trucks, primarily the legendary deuce-and-a-half GMC CCKWs, roaring down the roads in a non-stop river of steel. Engines rattling, tires bursting, headlights cutting through night like blades. And behind the steering wheels, 23,000 drivers, most of them African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units, told by society they were second class, yet now being asked to carry the entire U.S. war effort on their backs. They accepted that burden with pride and fire. Their motto became legendary: if you can't truck it, you can't fight. Every convoy ran the same cycle: load at Normandy, drive straight through the night, unload near the front, turn around and go back again.
No sleep, no stopping.
No mercy for breakdowns. On average, 30% of trucks failed daily. Engines coughing, axles cracking under impossible weight. But mechanics worked like surgeons, reviving the wounded machines in minutes so they could rejoin the endless flow. The Red Ball Express was a miracle of pressure and sweat, a living artery pumping lifeblood into the advance. Day after day, 12,500 tons of supplies rolled forward. Ammunition, medical supplies, artillery shells, fuel, always fuel. All of it devoured instantly by Patton's armies and the ground they seized next. German officers watched from the ruins of towers and villages, wide-eyed, speechless. Intercepted radio reports from Wehrmacht commanders reveal fear more chilling than gunfire. We hear them through the night. The American trucks never stop. That sound was the death knell of the German army. Because America wasn't just fighting troops, it was fighting with an entire industrial civilization. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh were building a truck a minute. Oil refineries in Texas and Pennsylvania were pouring oceans of fuel into storage tanks. Lives back home were changed, ration cards, war bonds, round-the-clock shifts, all to keep that steel river flowing. A German general finally admitted the brutal truth. The American army is like a dragon with 9 lives. Each time we cut one, 2 more appear. The Red Ball Express turned Patton's ambitions into unstoppable momentum. Every bolt, every bullet, every drop of gasoline, every tire worn down to threads, was one more step toward Berlin. And yet, for those behind the steering wheels, this wasn't glorious. It was grueling. Drivers were often teenagers, barely trained, racing convoys through terrain still crawling with snipers and mines. They risked death on every curve, every night run through pitch darkness without headlights to avoid detection. Rain made the roads slick as ice. German aircraft hunted them from above. Fatigue played tricks on their minds. More drivers died from accidents and exhaustion than from enemy fire. Still, they drove. A young sergeant named William "Red" Hawkins once said, "We weren't fighting with guns. We were fighting with gears." Those like Hawkins knew they weren't celebrated like combat heroes, but they also knew something most did not. They were helping win a war faster than any commander expected. By late September, the German High Command calculated a grim number. If the Americans kept moving supplies at this pace, the war could end 6 months earlier than anticipated. The Red Ball Express wasn't just moving cargo. It was stealing time from Hitler. And time was the one thing he could no longer afford to lose. On November 16th, after 82 days of nonstop operations, the Red Ball Express finally breathed. The emergency had passed. Railroads had been repaired. Ports were open. Other supply routes took over. But those 82 days had changed everything. 122 million ton-miles traveled. 412,193 total tons delivered. France and Belgium liberated by a roaring current of wheels and fuel. And the young black soldiers who made it happen returned quietly to their barracks, heroes with no parade. Many officers still treated them with prejudice. Many strangers still looked at their skin instead of their courage. They fought through the war, only to return home to segregation. But history would not forget. Their role was too monumental, their sacrifice too great, their resilience too undeniable. They proved a truth more powerful than bullets. Victory is built, loaded, driven, delivered. Every soldier on the front line, every tank, every rifle owed them a debt. Because heroes don't always hold the front. Sometimes they drive to it. The wheels of the Red Ball Express kept turning, long after the sunset disappeared behind the hedgerows of Normandy. Day after day, night after night, American trucks rolled forward with a singular purpose: to feed an army that refused to slow down. The Germans believed logistics would be the limitation of American ambition. They had calculated fuel consumption, supply attrition, road density, and bridge capacity. They believed Patton would outrun his lifeline. Instead, the United States built a lifeline that outran every German expectation. Behind the scenes, the core of the operation lived not in the glamorous headlines of advancing divisions, but in the grease-stained hands of mechanics, dispatchers, and transport officers who transformed raw industrial capacity into frontline mobility. They designed routes that did not exist a week earlier. They turned tiny country lanes into one-direction arteries of war. They erected signposts that pointed drivers through blackened nights where headlights were forbidden. They had mapped every road strong enough to hold a 10-ton GMC truck, and every shortcut that shaved precious minutes off a supply run. Every convoy was a living equation. A quarter ton of fuel burned for every ton delivered. Tires shredded themselves on rough roads. Engines overheated under constant strain. Breakdowns were not occasional incidents. They were expected components of the mission. The planners built redundancy into every mile. A vehicle that stopped moving became a liability that threatened thousands of gallons of critical fuel behind it. So breakdown crews followed every convoy, prepared to throw a chain around a stalled truck and drag it into a ditch if repairs could not be completed within minutes. They had no luxury of time, because Patton's tanks devoured fuel like starving beasts. His Third Army alone used over 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day. An armored spearhead without fuel was no spearhead at all. Just metal carcasses sitting in a field, waiting to be destroyed. So the trucks rolled, carrying jerrycans stacked like ammunition crates, barrels bulging against wooden frames, and tank trailers sloshing with the lifeblood of mobility. While generals debated strategy hundreds of miles away, young logistics officers performed feats that had never been attempted at this scale. They standardized convoy spacing, not too close to create a target, not too far to disrupt flow. They enforced speed controls even when adrenaline demanded faster. They operated 24 hours a day, with no shift that allowed the roads to sleep. Darkness became both a shield and a threat. Without lights, drivers navigated by the faint glow of blackout markers and the memory of curves they had survived the night before. Gasoline was not the only cargo. Ammunition arrived in every shape and caliber. .50 caliber belts in metal tins, 105mm shells clattering within wooden crates, bazooka rockets bundled like firewood. Food rations traveled in mountains of crates, some fresh enough to remind soldiers what normal life tasted like, others canned to last until the war itself became history. Tires alone became an industry of their own. At any moment, thousands of wheels spun under maximum weight. Blowouts happened every hour. A convoy could not wait for a tire change. There was always another truck right behind, and another right behind that. The Germans joked that the Americans seemed to be throwing entire factories onto the roads. They were not far from the truth. Every day, truckloads arrived with nothing but tires and spare parts to keep the others running. Mechanics set up roadside workshops, open-air repair zones where engines roared back to life, dripping oil and war dust. As the pressure increased, logistics officers refined their methods. They discovered that mixing gasoline loads with ammunition was a disaster waiting to happen. So dangerous cargo was separated into specialized convoys. They scheduled maintenance rotations, rotating worn-out vehicles out of the line long enough for repairs that kept breakdowns from cascading into chaos. But no amount of planning could eliminate the hazards of war. German aircraft, whenever fuel allowed, swooped down on the convoys like vultures attacking arteries. Strafing runs scattered drivers into ditches, leaving trucks burning with their precious cargo. Anti-aircraft guns mounted on lead vehicles barked back defiantly, filling the sky with tracer lines. Yet for every truck destroyed, 10 more surged forward, replacing loss with overwhelming abundance. The Germans watched and listened in disbelief. Officers interrogated captured drivers, demanding to know how many trucks the Americans had. The answers seemed impossible. The Wehrmacht measured logistics by rail and rationed each kilometer of advance with mathematical caution. The Americans treated distance as an inconvenience, one that could be conquered with horsepower and fuel. It was not enough to move supplies forward. Empty trucks needed to return fast enough to reload. Convoys became a continuous orbit, a wheel turning on asphalt and ambition. Drivers often spent more time inside their cabs than in their bunks. Meals were handed through windows. Coffee became more important than gasoline. Fatigue was another enemy, one that attacked the mind instead of the body. If a driver fell asleep, the truck might drift off the road, roll over a ditch, or slam into the rear of the vehicle ahead. To reduce exhaustion, platoon leaders rotated driving duties whenever possible. But the truth lived in the reality that manpower was always stretched thin. Many drivers learned to sleep with one eye open, resting only in the seconds when the convoy paused to reform. The rumble of engines became both lullaby and alarm bell. Dispatch centers monitored every route like battlefield command posts. Radios crackled with reports of delays, breakdowns, and enemy sightings. Battalion HQs tracked fuel levels not by the day, but by the hour. The question was never whether supplies would arrive, it was how soon. Patton's staff sent increasingly urgent telegrams. Ammunition levels critical, tank fuel reserves dropping, forward units limiting movement. Every message reminded the drivers why stopping was never an option. The transport officers understood that the enemy watched every mile. German reconnaissance spotted the ribbons of dust rising behind the convoys. Artillery targeted choke points and bridges. Mines littered the shoulders of rural paths. Yet the trucks came anyway, multiplying faster than they could be destroyed. Engineers became heroes without newspapers printing their names. They reinforced bridges overnight using lumber, steel plates, and ingenuity. They constructed bypasses in hours that would normally require days. Bulldozers dragged logs, rubble, and whatever else they could find to shape makeshift roads that carried convoys into the heart of France. This logistical momentum created a new kind of warfare, one where speed dictated strategy. Patton calculated advances based on fuel availability rather than enemy presence. He did not wait for permission, he only waited for gasoline. And when the Red Ball Express delivered, he surged forward like a predator sensing weakness. Behind every mile he gained, planners recalculated supply distances and reoriented the routes. What was once a forward depot became a rear position almost overnight. The roads were extended, the delivery times increased, and the urgency intensified. Every success made tomorrow's task even harder. Still, the system adapted. They introduced leapfrogging depots. Temporary supply bases moved rapidly forward, staged at new capture points. Fuel bladders were set up in fields, becoming liquid reservoirs visible from the sky. Some were destroyed by Luftwaffe bombs, erupting in towering plumes of fire that lit the horizon red. The drivers saw the flames and only pushed harder. Every gallon lost meant the war would take longer. Meanwhile, the Germans were starving for fuel themselves. Their panzers sat immobile. Their trucks were cannibalized for spare parts. The contrast could not have been more stark. One army drowning in abundance, the other suffocating in scarcity. Captured Nazi officers complained bitterly in interrogation reports. They could not understand how the Americans retained supply superiority despite distance, weather, and destruction. One officer wrote that the convoys seemed endless, as if they had tapped a reservoir larger than continents. He was not exaggerating. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, and Europe was learning what that truly meant. Every driver understood the stakes. A delay in their delivery meant a delay in victory. The road in front of them became a battlefield where the weapon was movement and the enemy was time itself. They became soldiers of momentum. Their engines were their rifles. Their cargo was hope for the men burning through gasoline as fast as courage allowed. Yet logistics did not forgive mistakes. One miscalculated turn, one overloaded axle, one misread signpost, and an entire line of trucks could stretch immobilized for miles. So discipline became its own form of armor. Orders emphasized precision. Maintain spacing, maintain speed, maintain silence. Conversations quieted to whispers. Drivers listened to engines like physicians listen to heartbeats. A cough from the exhaust, a sudden loss of power, a temperature gauge climbing into the red. These were warnings that demanded immediate response. The maintenance battalions worked under pressure that rivaled surgeons in operating rooms. Parts were stripped from wrecks faster than records could be updated. Welding torches sparked in the dark, repairing frames bent from overload. Gearboxes were rebuilt on roadside jacks. They created solutions faster than manuals could be written. And still, the tonnage numbers grew. 12,000 tons. 15,000. More. Every record broken created a new baseline to surpass. The Germans had insisted no nation could supply that much material over such distance without using fixed rail networks. The Americans did not argue back. They simply built highways of victory 1 mile at a time. As Patton's armor sliced deeper into France, frontline soldiers heard the distant thunder of engines long before they saw the trucks. To them, the sound meant certainty. Certainty that they would continue moving, fighting, winning. The booming roar became psychological dominance. It reminded German troops that they fought an enemy who could replace anything lost, at any moment. While tank crews and infantry divisions earned headlines for liberating towns and capturing territory, the drivers of the Red Ball Express remained anonymous to the public. Their heroism was measured not in medals, but in mileage. Their victories were not scored by enemy casualties, but by gallons delivered and roads conquered. They did not fire artillery. They delivered it. They did not charge into machine gun fire. They carried the bullets that silenced it. Without them, every triumphant advance would have stalled into a forgotten failure. The pride of their work came from necessity. Every delivery was a victory that could be quantified. They kept logs documenting every barrel and crate offloaded. They stamped manifests that marked the progress of freedom itself. For when the supply line holds, the front line prevails. As the operation intensified, the flow of information became as important as the flow of goods. Dispatch families operated like nervous system signals, communicating which routes remained alive and which arteries had been severed. Reroutes could happen at any moment. A bridge collapsed, a road blocked by a wreck, enemy forces spotted ahead. Drivers pivoted without protest, trusting the system to keep them moving. Convoy commanders memorized alternative paths like chess players visualizing boards tens of moves ahead. Their tactical decisions saved entire columns from ambushes and bottlenecks. Their leadership often received little recognition, but their influence moved divisions. Even weather joined the battlefield. Rain turned roads into mud pits that sucked tires down like quicksand. Engines roared in futility as trucks slid sideways into ditches. Yet the convoys persisted, chaining axles, spreading gravel, or simply pushing stuck vehicles out of the mire through sheer determination. Heat punished radiators, cold stiffened engines into silence. Fog erased the line between road and death. And still the trucks advanced. At night, discipline against lighting was strict. Even a cigarette ember could draw sniper fire. Drivers learned to navigate by instinct, counting telephone poles or fence posts as guides through blindness. If a truck overturned, the convoy braced for the sound. Sometimes the silence afterward was worse. Every mile carried risk, and the risks multiplied without mercy. But the drivers accepted danger as part of the mission because failure meant something far worse than personal harm. Failure meant the front would stop. And if the front stopped, the war would last longer. More lives would be lost. The enemy would dig deeper and fight harder. So the drivers endured. The mechanics endured. The planners endured. Logistics became the invisible triumph that fed the visible victory. Without applause, without spotlight, the greatest movement of supply in military history unfolded with stubborn persistence. The Red Ball Express proved that war was no longer won by who controlled the battlefield, but by who controlled the roads leading to it. And the roads belonged to the United States. The Red Ball Express did not last forever. It was born in urgency and designed for speed, a temporary lifeline meant to push the Allies across France before the Germans could stabilize their shattered defenses. And in that mission, it succeeded beyond what anyone predicted. By November of 1944, port facilities had been captured and railways repaired enough to ease the burden on the convoys. The nonstop thunder of truck engines began to fade from the night air. But its impact remained, not just in the fuel tanks of Patton's tanks or the crates of ammunition stacked along the front. Its legacy lived in every mile liberated not by fire alone, but by movement. The Red Ball Express proved something the world had never seen at such scale: that logistics could win a war as surely as bullets and armor. German generals who once mocked American industrial power were forced to rewrite their assessments. Their armies, starved of every resource, could only watch as a nation of factories sent its lifeblood surging across a continent. With each delivery, the United States shattered the myth of German superiority and replaced it with a new reality: that the arsenal of democracy did not rely on miracle weapons, but on relentless supply. Yet within that triumph lived thousands of individual stories. Mechanics whose hands were raw from repairing engines in the dark. Dispatchers who coordinated chaos with the precision of surgeons. Drivers who endured exhaustion, fear, and danger without hesitation. Many of them young, many of them under-recognized, many of them segregated by the very country they fought to defend. History would eventually write the numbers: 412,193 tons of supplies delivered, 5,958 trucks running 24 hours a day, more than 122 million ton-miles traveled. The war shortened by months because the front never stopped. But numbers alone could never capture the true cost. The lives risked on narrow roads under blackout conditions. The convoys attacked from the air and ambushed from the hedgerows. The miles driven with eyes burning from exhaustion and nerves frayed from the knowledge that one mistake meant death. Not just for the driver, but for everyone behind him. They kept going anyway. Long after the last convoy shut down its engine and the final signpost was pulled from the roadside, the spirit of the Red Ball Express endured. It became a blueprint for modern military logistics. It changed how future armies would fight, not limited by distance but empowered by movement. The United States would never again underestimate the power of supply, and no enemy would underestimate it either. The war in Europe would rage on into 1945. The Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, the final push into Germany, all of it depended on supply lines first proven possible by those convoys in France. When tanks rolled and infantry advanced, they did so with the confidence that trucks thundered behind them, loaded with the promise of tomorrow's victory. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than a logistics operation. It was a triumph of will over doubt, of innovation over limitation, of unity over division. It stood as proof that sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones carrying rifles at the front, but the ones carrying gasoline in the dark. The world remembers the battles that won the war. It should also remember the miles that made those battles possible. The miles driven by young Americans who never asked for glory, only the chance to keep moving forward. The war was won not only by those who fired the shots, but by those who made sure there was always one more bullet, one more ration, one more drop of fuel. When the tanks surged, when the infantry advanced, when the Allies refused to stop, it was because the Red Ball Express never did.